The year is 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte dominates the European continent after years of conquest and several failed coalitions formed against him. Although the French Emperor notionally reigns supreme, he struggles to keep his client states from engaging in trade with Great Britain, the only European kingdom that still openly defies him. To enforce his embargo, Napoleon raises an army and marches toward Moscow, intent on bringing the insubordinate Tsar to heel. Days after French boots cross onto Russian soil, something ghastly occurs in the southern reaches of the empire. The dead become animate once again, rising from their resting places to feast on the flesh of the living. Nobody knew it then, but hell was overflowing, and humanity's days were numbered. The blight quickly engulfed the continent, halting the war and uniting the belligerents in a military alliance against the undead menace. As Europe's fighting men fell by the thousands and rose again as profane ghouls, it quickly became apparent that conventional tactics alone were insufficient to halt the encroaching blight. Something more was needed. Perhaps if the source of the affliction was discovered, a viable counter could be developed. Tasked with seeking out any information about the nature of the blight, the Skit army began its campaign. While the blight had reached Scandinavia relatively early on, the undead presence there wasn't nearly as severe as it was in more populous regions. Thus, it was pegged as an ideal staging ground, and the 1st Expeditionary Division and Foreign Legion landed there in late 1815. They were to consolidate their strength and begin searching for leads in preparation for linking up with the 2nd Expeditionary Division, which was taking an overland route from the Far East. Vardøhus Fortress saw one of the earliest reports of the Blight 2 years prior, and a contingent of the Foreign Legion was sent to investigate the area for any clues that could give insight into the origin of the plague. This force, led by Sergeant Kazarkin, was able to sneak into the main courtyard and begin searching the buildings, encountering only minor resistance from zombie stragglers. As the night dragged on and more shamblers began shuffling into the fortress, a judgment call had to be made. Nothing of substance had yet been discovered, and the only unsearched room was a barred cell in the basement of the central hall. The sole way to access the cell's contents was by destroying the bars with a nearby cannon, though doing so would certainly attract a great deal of unwanted attention. If the cannon were fired, there could be no hesitation. The entire contingent would have to flee to the extraction point, a dock on the far side of the fortress, and pray that whatever they grabbed from the cell would be worth the danger. Time was running short, and the NCO in command made his decision. A colossal boom echoed through the snowstorm as the cell door was torn apart by round shot, and the Foreign Legion began its frantic escape from the fortress. Snowdrifts had blocked off the main route to the dock, and the soldiers were forced to split their attention between clearing the path and fending off the ever-growing mass of zombies pouring into the courtyard. It's here that the Legion suffers the first casualty of the entire campaign. Private Max Ryan Ocho was left behind in the confusion and succumbed to the horde, rising again to turn his axe on his comrades. Meanwhile, the beleaguered survivors successfully fight through the fortress and reach the dock, mounting a desperate defense in order to hold out long enough to be extracted. Things start off okay, but the situation quickly deteriorates as the undead arrive in greater numbers. The survivors suffer 2 further losses, one to advancing shamblers and another to the bitter cold. All hope seems lost as bombers destroy the final barricades on the dock, leaving the haggard soldiers open to attack, when Sergeant Kazarkin leads a desperate charge to push back the horde. This sudden respite buys Private King enough time to rebuild the defenses, and the remainder of the team is able to extract unharmed. As the survivors watch the writhing mass of pale flesh disappear into the distant snowstorm, they finally examine the documents they collected from the basement cell and discover inventory logs, sentry schedules, payrolls, nothing. As their high spirits sank, the members of the Foreign Legion could only hope that their brothers in arms were having more success elsewhere. Meanwhile, the 1st Expeditionary Division was busy in the south. With their forces organized, they now had to secure a route into the interior of the continent so they could begin operations there and achieve their strategic goal of linking up with the 2nd. However, the only viable route required traveling near Copenhagen, which was not only overrun with zombies, but also under bombardment by a rogue fleet intent on enforcing a total quarantine of the region. This fleet would have to be crippled if any attempts at travel were to be successful, and a squad of the Red Brigade, under the command of Captain Sean Creepington, began an operation to do just that. As the soldiers entered the burning city, they soon became bogged down in urban combat. The raging inferno blocked many paths through the streets and buildings, and the cramped environment meant that they couldn't see zombies until they were right on top of them. Because of these factors, the team opted to travel using roofs and attics, though this was only slightly less dangerous than being caught in the road. While traversing the roof of a burning building, Private Elliot lost his footing and fell inside, perishing in the flames. When the fire became too much of an obstacle to circumvent, the survivors were forced to ferry water from the streets up to their route in the buildings in order to progress, while also fending off the unending stream of undead that seeped out of every window, doorway, and alley. Despite this difficulty, the Red Brigade performed admirably and fought its way to the canal without taking any further casualties. Now ahead of them lay the final stretch of the mission, reaching an abandoned gunboat and using it to sink the brig patrolling the waters outside the city. The team fought tooth and nail for every foot they traveled down the street, fending off wave after wave of zombies until they finally reached the gunboat. As they drifted through the canals toward their target, they were assailed from all sides as hundreds of shamblers poured over the gunwales and musket fire and canister shot from the brig peppered the boat. As the hail of lead grew in intensity, Private Zembit was felled by an undead sapper while taking cover. Finally, when the distance closed to a smidgen, the gunboat landed a killing blow on the brig, sending it to the bottom of the channel and securing a route southward for friendly forces. Now the 1st Expeditionary and Foreign Legion could lick their wounds and wait for the 2nd to make its way west. The Snakeheads, for their part, had encountered their own fair share of trouble, and then some. Their journey to the front was slowed by poor terrain and constant attacks by mobs of shamblers concealed by the bad weather. At one point, they even had to repair a timber bridge across the freezing Berezina River, battling the clutches of hypothermia as much as the cold hands of the undead. Finally, they broke through into Central Europe, pursued by thousands of shamblers. This horde could not be allowed to hinder the greater mission, and it was decided that the ruined city of Leipzig would be used to neutralize the threat. The horde would be lured into the city and then trapped as the 2nd Expeditionary Division blew up the main bridge westward. Determined to finally be rid of this persistent thorn in his side, Commander Always took the 2nd's rearguard to personally oversee the operation. The squad used a church in the city center to create as much commotion as possible, then executed a swift retreat from the city. The formation was kept as tight as possible to avoid leaving any openings for the undead to exploit, and whenever there was a threat of being overwhelmed, the officers led surgical counterattacks that foiled the zombie advance. With the help of a heroic local, the team was able to leave the city and destroy the bridge without taking any casualties. Now that the 3 major elements had finally linked up, it was time to plan the next move. So far, the army had taken several casualties and had nothing to show for it. Vardahus was a bust, and investigations throughout the northern German states turned up nothing of substance. Paris had hosted the greatest battle of the war against the Blight before it was overwhelmed in early July. If humanity's doctors had discovered any crucial information about the Blight and how to fight it, they would have done so in Paris. Additionally, there is a clear spiritual component to the affliction, as evidenced by the Shambler's reaction to members of the clergy. The church in France still hadn't recovered from the revolutionary years, but it was strong in Spain. The Iberian Peninsula had remained largely untouched by the Blight as of yet, and even though the region was crowded with refugees from the east, it was still a much better environment than the hellscapes the army had been trudging through. Thus, a plan was formed. The Foreign Legion would occupy Pfalzgrafenstein Castle in the Bavarian city of Cobb in order to draw the bulk of the horde away from the main roads and keep it localized in southern Germany. This would clear the way for the 1st and 2nd Expeditionary Divisions to swing around the north toward their ultimate objectives, Paris and San Sebastian. Having replaced the losses suffered at Vardahus, the Foreign Legion was ready and eager to accomplish their mission. If they were to hold out in the castle, they'd need provisions, and since supply lines would be impossible once they were surrounded, the best course of action was to scavenge whatever they could from the town. The operation started off uneventfully. Legionaries encountered little resistance as they moved through the town, loading up a wagon with food, weapons, blankets, and fuel. The difficulty came when the squad reached its first major hurdle. The bridge to Pfalzgrafenstein was blocked by a sturdy gate, and the only way to destroy it was by using a cannon sitting in the adjacent courtyard. Their movements hadn't gone unnoticed by the Blighted, and they struggled to operate the artillery while repelling the accumulating horde. Every second spent frantically loading the cannon allowed more and more zombies to press in from the surrounding roadways, and the situation became dire. The turning point came when the gate was finally destroyed, revealing yet another horde on the far side which poured in and overwhelmed the survivors, taking down 2 men. With no path forward and their escape route swiftly collapsing, the remaining legionaries made a hasty retreat from the town and took shelter in a nearby farmhouse, where they held out in a desperate battle against the pursuing horde. By the time the 2nd Expeditionary arrived to rescue them, only a handful of men remained. The First Battle of Cobb and subsequent retreat had inflicted devastating losses on the Foreign Legion, rendering it combat ineffective for the remainder of the offensive campaign. Survivors of the battle were incorporated into the 2nd Expeditionary Division, who sent its own contingent to Cobb in a last-ditch attempt to capture the castle. The entire campaign hinged on consolidating the zombies here, and with the rate that they were arriving, there wouldn't be another chance. The hastily assembled squad wasted no time reaching the town. Already, fresh shamblers had infested the streets and the zombie presence was growing with each passing minute. With the physical obstacles already cleared by the predecessors, the 2nd Expeditionary made good time running through the town and reached the abandoned supply wagon without major incident. They cleared out the courtyard and began pushing the wagon down the bridge toward the final destination, condensing the approaching zombies into a single file and holding them at bay, while the head of the formation worked on lowering the castle drawbridge using hand grenades. As the drawbridge finally came down and the last man stepped inside the relative safety of the castle, the bridge was destroyed and sank into the river, isolating the men inside and preventing the now gargantuan mass of zombies from reaching them. There was just one final hurdle before victory could be declared. A large number of townsfolk had been quarantined in the cellar beneath the castle, where they succumbed to the blight. To truly claim the castle, these remaining shamblers would have to be dealt with. Once the defenses were set and the men were ready, the gates to the cellar were opened, and a profane flood surged out from the darkness to meet them. The disciplined tenacity of the soldiers kept the zombies at bay, but unbeknownst to them, a few stragglers still remained above them in the tower. These zombies gradually began destroying the upper defenses, unperturbed by the chaos unfolding beneath them. By the time the survivors noticed what was happening, it was too late. Most of their barricades had been torn down, and now the only thing between them and the unending stream of shamblers was the steel in their hands. The soldiers ran back up the stairs, turning only to cut down any zombies that got close enough to grab them. The cellar was finally empty. This gaggle represented the last of the blighted horde, but there was nowhere to run, no space to fight. As the survivors found themselves at the end of the line and out of options, they braced together as Hell's final assault slammed into them. Despite the odds, the 2nd Expeditionary Division emerged victorious. Their mission complete, the soldiers could now rest and wait for extraction, content in the knowledge that the offensive would go on. With the bulk of the shamblers in the region drawn to Cobb, the 1st Expeditionary Division had an easy time reaching France. Paris had been the site of a cataclysmic battle, and the city was positively swarming with shamblers. The only option was stealth. In order to traverse the area without alerting the horde, the Red Brigade made use of the labyrinthine catacombs beneath the city. While these narrow corridors weren't devoid of shamblers, the zombie presence was manageable, and any combat that took place wouldn't alert the crowds on the surface. Paris had been home to a prominent physician by the name of Lionel Rousseau, one of the world's premier minds when it came to the blight. He was forced to flee his home when the city fell to the undead, leaving behind valuable research. The 2nd Expeditionary was able to quietly secure many notes, letters, illustrations, and manuscripts from his domicile before sneaking back into the catacombs. Not wanting to press their luck, the soldiers decided that they had enough to exfiltrate from the city. The escape plan involved using the subterranean passageways to reach a large church and ringing the bell, which would signal a small boat to come down the canal and pick them up. With research in hand, the squad began to fight its way toward the church. The oppressive darkness of the catacombs concealed shamblers in every corner and made navigation difficult. The human remains lining every wall gave a foreboding sense of futility with each inky hallway. The zombies in the catacombs were numerous, but the Red Brigade was disciplined and had grown accustomed to fighting in the tunnels. Each surprise wave of shamblers was met with a swift and brutal counter, and every zombie that encountered the men of the 1st Expeditionary found itself joining the mountains of bones in the catacomb walls. Despite the easy progress, the soldiers remained focused. They knew that the worst was yet to come. Any zombie presence down here is dwarfed by the writhing masses on the surface, and yet that's where they'd have to go. Finally, the squad reached a gate and emerged into the dark, rainy streets of Paris. They had planned their route thoroughly. The exit placed them a mere block away from the church. The location had also been prepared with 2 artillery pieces for when the horde was alerted, an uncomfortable inevitability. As the men took their positions and erected their defenses, the bell was rung, and the battle began. Immediately, shamblers began to trickle into the road, drawn by the noise and commotion. This trickle soon grew into a stream, then a river. Lightning flashed, illuminating the sea of pale bodies trudging toward the soldiers of the bridge. The men opened fire with their muskets, picking off choice targets while the cannons tore massive rends in the zombie lines. Still, they kept pushing closer. More and more zombies joined the horde until it seemed as if the entire city was coming down this meager group of soldiers. The very cobblestones of the road disappeared into the horrifying mass of reanimated flesh, a relentless and unholy force that mindlessly pressed down the road with the singular goal of extinguishing the men who defied it. The cannons were red hot, throwing canister after canister into the mob as the men on the front lines cut with their sabers, thrust with their bayonets, and chopped with their axes until their muscles screamed at them. Just as the final barricades were crushed by rotting hands and the zombies surged forward, the rescue boat arrived beneath the bridge. The exhausted survivors ran with all they had and dove into the boat, watching as the position they just held drowned in the wave of shamblers. They had done it. This research would prove invaluable to humanity once it reached the right hands. There was still hope for ending this nightmare once and for all. The final action of the campaign fell to the 2nd Expeditionary Division. As the remnants of the Foreign Legion were shuttled away from Cobb and the Red Brigade was debriefed after their stint in Paris, the Snakeheads were tasked with infiltrating the coastal city of San Sebastian, which had recently fallen to the Blight. The city had previously hosted several councils of church leaders to discuss the zombie plague and potential remedies. If any clergy were still alive in San Sebastian, they'd be holed up in the fortress overlooking the city. The 2nd Expeditionary was to go to the fortress and extract any survivors. When they did make entry, the soldiers discovered a lone man locked in a cell, who introduced himself as Father Alberto. With the priest in tow, the squad began the long journey down to the beach. The fortress was built to withstand a siege, and the path to the city was purposefully long and difficult. With every switchback, the soldiers were assailed by lingering groups of zombies. The denizens of the city were freshly turned, and they proved much faster and more aggressive than most shamblers. Still, they proved no match for the coordination of the soldiers. Each time the roads swelled with shamblers, the squad would regroup and defeat it, or otherwise escape without getting caught up. After a long, winding path through the city, they reached the coastal fort and signaled for the extraction ship. So far, so good. Nobody had been seriously injured and salvation was in sight. Now all that remained was to lower the lift to the beach and board the longboat. As the squad began falling back and preparing to leave, disaster struck. The lift operator, Barry, was killed by zombies, leaving the platform suspended. In a historic display of bravery, Sergeant Kazarkin, hero of the Battle of Vardahus, selflessly climbed onto the roof and personally lowered the lift, sacrificing his own life to enable the escape of his comrades. Now on the beach, the men made a hasty barricade and fended off the ever-growing number of zombies trudging across the sand. The rescue boat finally landed, and as the shamblers struggled against the abandoned barricades, the last Skid Army soldier stepped off of European soil. Mission fulfilled. With the research recovered from Paris and the testimony of Father Alberto, humanity made great strides toward understanding the affliction that had devastated the world. Maybe it was still pointless. Maybe the Blight was unstoppable, and it was merely a matter of time before humanity was snuffed out once and for all. But maybe, just maybe, life can still triumph. Thank you all so much for watching this video and participating in the Halloween event. As you probably know, my schedule has been absolutely crazy. Since my last video, I've gone from living comfortably in Missouri to deploying to Kuwait, and it'll honestly be a miracle if this video actually gets out by Halloween. Still, I just want you all to know that I love you guys. I'm going to keep making videos from overseas, and hopefully things will settle down. Please have a safe Halloween, and I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.